Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jersey Joe Corner. It is brought to you by Big Heads Media. It is going to be a great hockey season coming right up. A lot of interesting things. Anchor.fm will help you start your podcast and get things rolling. It's going to be a lot smoother when you get the Anchor app, and it's so much easier to navigate. Even their online website at anchor.fm is very efficient, and you can do a lot of great things with it. And I stand by it myself. And I must say, it's time to say, let's go Devils.
With the first pick overall, the New Jersey Devils are proud to select from the U.S. program, Jack Hughes.
Let's go, baby!
Plays it across, Vatanen drives, score! Sammy Vatanen let it rip. It's a power play goal, and the Devils have opened it up.
Oh, my.
Nico walking in, shooting, score! Nico Asher on the rush, ends it in overtime, and the Devils win it in Montreal.
Hey,
Hey, you're back.
hey, well, everybody, it's Will Scouch from Scouching.ca. Welcome to the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So it is officially the 2019-2020 season. First 10-plus NHL games in the books. So I wanted your take on Alexis Lafreniere.
Oh, him. I think I've heard of him. I think I know that person.
A Rimouski boy?
Yeah, the Rimouski boy. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to me to consider really knocking him out of that number one spot this early in the year. So far, he's been incredible. He's on pace for 160 plus points in the QMJHL, which is remarkable. The thing that makes him so special is just how much he just gets the game. It's hard to knock him off pucks. He seems to always be winning everything that you throw at him. He's really, really hard to counter. He's got a really big bag of tricks that's really tough to get on top of. I think that, Quinton Byfield is giving him a run for his money for sure, but it is certainly not a bad choice to choose from either of those players at number one this year.
And so for those people who are wondering if Quinton Byfield, the young one out of the OHL, being the Sudbury Wolves center, Craig Button once said, you have a battle of the two top players. You either go with the one guy that's a center, the one guy that's a winger. They usually say the Alex Ovechkin winger usually wins. How would you compare Alexis Lafreniere amongst all the other wingers like Capo Caco or Pierre-Luc Dubois and all the other wingers before him in recent drafts? You there?
Hello?
Hey.
Hello. I am still here.
Yeah, so what I was saying, how would you compare Alexis Lafreniere as a winger compared to Capo Caco, Patrick Laine, and Pierre-Luc Dubois?
They're a bit different. I mean, no two players are identical. But whenever I watch Alexis Lafreniere, he always strikes me as that sort of Mark Stone type of winger, someone who is very good in both ends of the ice, and no matter what the situation, he just keeps getting the job done. So whether it's whether it's, rushing pucks up the ice on his own or passing pucks to his teammates or utilizing his teammates well, positioning himself in the offensive end and defensive end to push play in the right direction. He always seems to be there. He doesn't really have the hands or the skill of someone like an Artemi Panarin, for example. His shot isn't as insanely good and one-dimensional as Patrick Laine. He's kind of in a different sort of realm than those players. He kind of has those shades of Capo Caco, but I'm pretty sure there's more to like about Lafreniere than Capo Caco. I just think that, he just knows the game seems to come a lot more naturally to him, and he doesn't need to, Capo Caco is an extremely hard-working offensive player when you watch him play, but there isn't so much of that sort of natural just gift of playing the game, I think, that Lafreniere seems to have. Now, whether that translates to the National Hockey League particularly well, we'll see. I mean, I don't see a reason why it wouldn't, but it is really, really high level there. He might not have the flash, but one way or the other, he's getting his points. One way or the other, he's driving, goal differentials and shot differentials, and he just plays the game to just push play the right direction.
So he, in a sense, he's a little bit above Nico Hischier in that realm of it, and he's a little bit under Jack Hughes in those parts of the game. So do you see that?
Yeah, I think that this year's draft has I think this year's draft has a multitude of players that could be in that sort of high-end group from the last couple of seasons, especially up front at forward. 2018 was marked by, I think, a historical class of defensemen at the top end. I think 2019 had really good talent, but, outside of that U.S. national team where there was a lot of good talent on one team, I think this year's draft kind of so far has blown that year out of the water. And I think that with Lafreniere, you're seeing something you don't see a whole lot of. Like, I personally see more out of Lafreniere that I like than a Patrick Laine. I see more out of him that I like than even a Capo Caco. But, Jack Hughes, I think comparing him to Jack Hughes in terms of raw playing ability is a little tougher because they don't play the same position. They don't play the same style of game. Whereas if you're looking at, say, a Quentin Byfield and a Jack Hughes, like, do I look at a Byfield over Hughes? And the answer to that is probably yes. And so I think with Lafreniere, he's an interesting case of a bit of a different class that's kind of hard to directly evaluate versus the rest of the guys that have been drafted in recent years. He's just kind of a different style of player, I think.
And so we talk about we segued over to one of my favorites is definitely Quentin Byfield. I mean, you look at the size, you look at the speed on him. He can be a playmaker. What do you think of him as his attributes that dominate the OHL and the Sudbury Wolves?
Sure. So when I came into this season, I had concerns about Byfield, especially after the Holinka. I thought, okay, this is a guy who I'm not sure if he's Eric Lindros or if he's Chris Stewart, whether he's a guy who has the skill and the skating to actually dominate against pretty much anyone, or if he's just a really big dude who just has his way with younger, smaller talent. And I think that kind of has gone away at this point. Like, he seems really, when I watch him, he really reminds me of a guy like Evgeny Malkin, really, really high levels of skill, extremely high level of like hands. His hands are extremely good for someone his size. His shot isn't necessarily maybe the hardest shot I've ever seen, but he gets it off really quick. He's got the same amount of goals thus far in the season as Alexis Lafreniere does. His playmaking is also great. His vision is good. The only really negative that I've seen out of him is thus far in the year, he seems to trail off a bit during games. He's extremely dominant early and tends to kind of slow down, especially in his own end towards the end of a game. But that's not something I'm really concerned about long term. Considering how young he is, considering how good he's been for Sudbury this year, and considering the talent and the size combination, I really have a hard time bumping him any lower than 2 in this year's draft, especially thus far in the season.
I was going to say, when I look at him on the film, on YouTube, I see a lot of things to ooze over on his physical and offensive game. And I think if you talk about those smaller details, as he becomes 18 years of age and whatnot, and, maintaining that strength and all that, the mental side of things, he could be one of those really special players. Like when Evgeny Malkin leaves the league, we have our new version of Malkin.
Yeah, I would believe that. I mean, maybe there's a bit more of a like a Alex Barkov to him, but I don't really think that level of elite skill is there. I just think the combination of size, power, his skating ability, a bunch of these different factors that you usually don't see out of such big players so young, I think is really, really rare. And even if you end up with someone like a Ryan Getzlaf style of player out of it, that's still a really, really good hockey player to pick up. But I do think that his potential is enormous based on what I've seen so far this year.
And so we talk about those really, like high danger, mid danger type players, kind of like a Getzlaf. But we're going to go across the waters to Sweden, to Gothenburg Frölunda Hockey Club with Lucas Raymond, a 5'10", 170-pound Swedish left winger, right shot. He's a 2002 March 28th birthday. Please tell our viewers about Lucas Raymond. You there?
He's an interesting player. I think there's a lot to like with Lucas Raymond. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. Cool. Anyway, with him, I think there's a lot to like, but I think he's gotten off to a bit of a slow start this year. I think it's so far a case of, maybe there are some other guys that I think are catching up to him this year. Whereas he, it's not so much he's been bad, but more about other players catching up to him. I think that he's got a really refined and mature game, and you have to keep in mind he's playing against grown men in one of the best hockey leagues in the world that is in North America. So he's doing okay. He's driving possession really well. The points aren't really there, but you can see brief flashes of it. I think he's a player that for full-time top-line minutes should probably be loaned out to the Swedish second division. He's been back in the junior leagues for a bit, but I think he's just too good for that level. I think I'm not personally too concerned about his long-term potential. Just this season, I think there's a few players that are sort of.
Yeah. So you talk about not being concerned about his long-term. I do like the fact that he's a really good setup man, and he does, make the right plays behind the net as well. And you there? You hear me?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah. So I was trying to say that Lucas is a really good setup man.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that I've seen that really stands out about him that I find really projectable that you don't see in players his age usually is his play along the boards is really, really good. He's able to shake off defenders. He's able to create space for himself with the puck really, really well. I think that what's kind of coming a bit of a ways for him is adjusting to playing against men, playing against the faster tempo of the game. I think I've caught him, I wouldn't say looking lost in his own end, but maybe not engaging himself enough to really turn play around. He kind of needs other players on the ice to turn the play around and go in his direction. But once the pucks are in the offensive end, he's really, really good at cycling pucks around and cutting into dangerous areas, making a play. I think it's just you're going to need to be a little bit patient with him. I think, again, the potential is there for him to be a really, really good, at the very least, offensive winger, with really good line mates. But again, I'm pretty sure that, going into this season, it felt like Lafreniere was at that number one slot. No one could say anything. And then Raymond and Byfield were 2-3 interchangeable. I'm pretty sure right now it's Lafreniere and Byfield at the top, and then there might be a group of 8 or 9 guys maybe that could go in any direction from 3 to 10 or something like that. So it's been interesting to see, especially when you compare Raymond to some of the other guys, especially the other players in Sweden that are playing with him, and how that's sort of translated. And I think patience will be required with Raymond, at least this early in the season.
I would like to think that Lucas Raymond has the potential to be a little bit better than, let's say, a Cole Caulfield from last year's draft. Do you think there's any sort of potential that he can do in that form of draft position and potential?
Well, I think if the thing is, those two players are quite different. So Cole Caulfield, has one of the best shots to come through the draft in quite a while. And if Lucas Raymond is a 15th overall pick this year, then the team that's picking at 15th overall sprints up to the stage so fast that their knees explode to draft him. I don't think that it's going to go similarly for Raymond as it did for Caulfield, and it shouldn't. I just think that, when you look at Lucas Raymond, I think that what NHL teams are really going to like is how refined and mature his play along the boards are. NHL coaches are looking for guys who can play along the boards, battle for pucks, and when they have the puck along the boards, they do whatever they can to prevent the opposing team from pinning them against the boards or from losing the puck easily. And Raymond is well on his way to being that type of a player. His offensive upside, he can play offensively. He's got the skill to score points. He's done it at the under 20 level extremely well for multiple seasons now. It's just a question of translating that to the Swedish Hockey League. And I think once he starts to learn the positioning of the...
So you talk about his transition. What about Alexander Holtz and his projection? Hold on a second, you there?
Yo.
Yay.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was trying to say, what do you think of his Swedish junior teammate Alex Holtz?
So Holtz is more up that Caulfield alley. I think, if you wanted to have a discussion of goal scorers in each draft, he's the closest thing to a Cole Caulfield as you're going to get. Last I checked, he was a 30 goal scorer last year in the junior leagues, and this year, 4 goals through 15 games in the SHL doesn't sound like a whole lot, but for someone his age, that's pretty good. He's got a lot of talent. He's got, he's a good skater. He's an aggressive forechecker. He does all these things really right that I think NHL teams are going to really like. I question his overall potential. His passing game isn't fantastic. He can have a bit of a careless streak with his puck movement and all that. But when you're in the offensive zone and, he's a player who even on the power play would be a really significant asset. I personally right now see him a little bit lower down the ladder than some of the other guys in this range, just because he is a great goal scorer and he does play aggressively and he, plays the right way, so to speak. I'm not sure of the whole complete version of his game being as good as some of the other guys in this range. But that doesn't mean that that's a negative. I mean, scoring goals is what you need to do to win games, and he does that very well. So I certainly will be looking for him to continue this trend over the course of the year. Being on pace for 21 points in an SHL season would be the most since Rasmus Dahlin. So that's notable. And if he can keep that up, especially playing significant minutes with his team, then that would be really positive for him.
And so it sounds like the Swedish national team will be even harder to play against, whether it's Team Canada, Russia, or the US.
This is a good year for Sweden. There's a few names that I think, they might have as many as 4 or 5 Swedish players playing in Sweden go in the first round this year. It wouldn't surprise me to see maybe even a bit more than that. Guys like Zion Nybeck, guys like Helga Grans, guys like Emil Andre even have been good to start the year. So Sweden's having a good year. But this year, to me, Canada has had a big year this year. There's a lot of Canadians in the Canadian Hockey League who are really, really exciting to watch. And especially in a year where the US is on a bit of a downturn, but there are some European players. Germany has a few good ones. Sweden, Finland again has a few good ones to keep an eye on. But this year's first round, I think, could be and should be dominated by North American, Canadian Hockey League players.
And so we're going to move on to Cole Perfetti. So he's someone that I saw a little bit during the Jack Hughes draft. So tell us about Cole Perfetti.
So Cole Perfetti is a guy he certainly had an extremely good Holinka tournament before the season began. He really felt like he was in mid-season form when a few guys just didn't really look like they could keep up with him. The best asset with him is just how smart he is offensively. He positions himself really well to get himself zone entries in the offensive zone. He's a great puck distributor. On the power play, he can be absolutely devastating. His shot is fine, but I don't really see him as good a goal scorer as he is a playmaker. He just really strikes me as a really reliable offensive player. Now, Saginaw is playing him at wing a lot more than at center, and I do see why. I think his defensive game is okay. His skating ability is okay. I wouldn't say it's particularly fantastic, but his hands are great. His skill is extremely high level. His creativity is extremely good. Someone taking a swing on him at third overall this year would not surprise me in the slightest. There's only, I think that might not be the way that I go, but if you end up with a really, really creative puck distributor that can play on the wing, then there's nothing really wrong with that. Someone who might not have the best skating ability, but a really, really good playmaking ability, maybe like a Taylor Hall type of player wouldn't be completely out of the question for me at third overall in Cole Perfetti. Maybe not the flashiest offensive guy, but certainly has the skill and the vision to skate with the best of them.
So he has speed and really good versatility on the wing. Certainly a good two-way player in that sense of it, in the offensive zone. Is he good defensively?
In his own end, he can certainly cover well enough. I would need to see more. I think his offensive game obviously is all there. It's he's scoring a tremendous amount of points. I would need to watch more over the course of the full season. I think that considering he's a winger, or he's being used as a winger, I should say, the amount of defensive involvement that he's been putting in, I think that's kind of coming a ways over the course of what I've seen. I'm not totally sure, though. I think he relinquishes a lot of zone entries as a winger that I think you would like him to be a bit more involved in defensively. I think it makes adjusting to, say, the National Hockey League might be a bit of an issue if he's going to go straight to the NHL next season, which is possible. But I do think that the skill is certainly there. His ability to cut off breakouts is there. I just think that he maybe doesn't put in the intensity defensively that at the NHL level you're going to need to enable the offensive skill that he has.
And so we're going to segue over to Russia. We're going to talk about this really good goaltender in Yaroslav Askarov. So yes. I heard that the Canadians had fits with him. So please tell me more about this very tall, 6'2", 160-pound Russian.
Yes. Well, so the thing is that goalies are really, really hard to judge, especially when they're 17 years old. It's always kind of like Russian roulette, when you're drafting goaltenders in the first round. More often than not, it doesn't work out, especially prior to the last few years. And the last few years, the guys who have been drafted in the first round aren't old enough to really be making much of an impact. But Yaroslav Askarov, every time I've seen him play, he tends to really buck that trend. He just, you can't beat him. And the thing about it, I think, is you see a lot of goalies who you think this guy can't be beaten. So he played in the Russian Junior League last year, for example. There's a lot of goalies in the Russian Junior League who put up really, really good numbers. But the thing that you notice when I watch those goalies play, is that they're very athletic and they can get themselves in a position to make the first stop. And the intensity of the game around them isn't necessarily super high. So you're not, you give up a rebound, that rebound isn't shot again immediately. That rebound might be picked up in enough time so that the goalie can reset. Whereas with Askarov, his positioning is so smooth and he cuts off angles so efficiently that it's really just, he always seems to be ready to save a puck no matter what the situation is.
So I was wondering, do you think he's going to be better than Spencer Knight from last year's draft?
Yes, I'm pretty sure about that. I think with the team Spencer Knight was playing behind last year, I mean, the team Yaroslav Askarov is playing behind is very, very good. St. Petersburg's minor league team is a very good team. It's just Spencer Knight was playing behind a team that was 4 lines deep of extremely talented hockey players. I was always impressed with Spencer Knight, but not so impressed with him that I was going to forego drafting a lot of players who went in the first round last year to take him. Whereas with Askarov, I mean, there was a game last year at the under 18s, the gold medal game, where he faced off against Spencer Knight in the final. And there was, I counted at least 3 or 4 real grade A cross ice scoring chances where it was Jack Hughes passing pucks to Bobby Brink or Cole Caulfield. And Askarov was right there ready to stop those pucks as if it was nothing for him. Whereas I think a lot of other young goaltenders have to really, really work hard to stop those pucks. Just playing the position, I think, comes really naturally to Askarov. He's 6'3", so the size concerns, which I think can be legitimate, those are kind of thrown out the window. To have him available past, to me, 10th, 11th, or 12th overall is a point where if you're a team that, even if you have an NHL starting goaltender right now, you can never have too much good goaltending, and that's a player that I certainly would make a bet on, especially if you're one of the teams this year that has 2 first-round picks, and you can afford to bet on him at the very least becoming a very good backup, which I think he could be much better than very quickly. He's playing against men, and I think that for his age, he's the only player in recent memory that has played at that level and at least done well and played consistently. So he's setting a bar really, really high for other goaltenders in the future. And I think that whenever I watch him, there's just something about him that really stands out as a player that I think enables a lot of confidence for his team.
And so we talk about players that do really good in those vicinities. I want to touch on this Finnish center in Helsinki's HIFK player in Anton Lundell. So what do you make of him in this year's draft?
So Lundell, again, is kind of like, to me, the center version of Alexis Lafreniere. So he's not a flashy player, and I don't think that the creativity, the playmaking is on the same level as Lafreniere at all. Obviously not, because he's not likely to go number 1 overall, but Lundell is probably, just in terms of positioning and two-way play at his age, one of the best in the draft. I think that he's always back checking hard. He's always positioning himself well in the offensive zone to get shots off. He's doing an extremely good job for his age, involving himself in offense in a good league in Finland. He covers a lot of ice during a game. He's always involved in both ends of the ice. I think that down the road, that's a player that if you're a contending team, he's your guy, say, on the second line. I don't think he's going to be that number 1 center that you can rely on to score 80 or 90 points in a season that's so hard to find and so rare. But I do think that as a really dependable, minutes-eating two-way guy who could put up, say, 60 points a season, then maybe you're looking at someone in Lundell that you can really trust in almost any situation of a game. He plays the right way. He covers open ice really, really well. And in both ends of the ice, he just plays so smart that the offense just kind of comes naturally. He's a player that I think top 10 is no question. Again, he's in that group where if someone went up and picked him 3rd overall, I would not be surprised. It would surprise me, but it wouldn't shock me. There's again 8, 9, 10 guys in that range that right now, if they went up at 3 and picked them, I could see the reasoning behind doing it.
So you're saying, like, let's say, come draft lottery, the top 16 teams, etc. are always hoping to find that stud in the middle of the pack. And some of those teams advance up or they make a big hefty move to move up in the draft, and they eventually, let's say, they get Lundell. What about Hendrix Lapierre of Chicoutimi in the QMJHL?
Yes. So Hendrix Lapierre, another guy similar to Cole Perfetti, exceptional at the Ivan Holinka, absolutely great there that I found. And that came away with, I believe, the scoring lead for Team Canada, if not second to Perfetti. But in any case, Lapierre is a guy who I think, similar to Raymond, there's a bit that I think is lacking with Lapierre that really withholds me from putting him in that top 10 group. I think that the skating ability is good. The ability to earn exits out of his own zone, the ability to earn entries into the offensive zone, it's all good. He's a good passer. He's a good skater. He's not going to score very many goals in the National Hockey League, I don't think. His shot is not great. He's not a dangerous scorer, I would say.
Would he be an assist guy?
Yeah, I think in terms of a puck distributing offensive player, it's certainly doable. I think that I'm lower on him than most, though. I think, he's ranked in the top 10. I know Craig Button had him number 3. I've only tracked data for one of his games, and the two areas where he stood out the most was passing pucks around the ice to move the puck up the ice in the right direction with control, and doing just that. So moving the puck with control is something he does really well. He's okay defensively. He gets his chances in dangerous areas, but it isn't necessarily, I find him to be a bit of a perimeter player. And I'm not sure, last year, the big player that was considered a perimeter player was Ryan Suzuki. And the thing that really made me believe that Ryan Suzuki wasn't going to be withheld because of that was because I think it was mental with him, the mental fortitude to push yourself into dangerous areas and actually challenge defenders a lot more. You need to have mobility and offensive intensity to do that. And Suzuki had it. He just wasn't using it. Whereas with Lapierre, I'm not sure that level of skating ability and that raw power is there. I think he's a first-round pick, certainly. I think he's a top 20 pick for sure. I just think in terms of a guy that goes in the top 10, it's there, but I'm not totally sold on it all coming together long-term. I think that in terms of, being aggressive on the forecheck, being aggressive on the back check, there's still work that can be done. And relative to some of the other guys that I've seen in this range, I think I'm a little more drawn away from Lapierre and towards guys more like the Marco Rossi's of the world or the Anton Lundells, if you want to draft a center who can really push play in the right direction, no matter what the situation.
So do you think Hendrix Lapierre will fall into the Joe Velino part on draft day?
I was going to mention Joe Velino in the same vein as a Ryan Suzuki. People kind of looked at Joe Velino and said, oh, here's a perimeter guy. But again, the skating ability was always there with Joe Velino. I just thought it was you had to sit him down and say, hey, man, like you have the talent to be a much more dangerous player around the net, which is where more points are. You can get more points is when you push towards the net, you find open men in tight and get those easy points. Whereas guys like Lapierre tend to stick around the outside of the net, hold on to the puck a lot and move it around there. And the mobility, I don't think, is quite there. Obviously, though, the good thing is that skating can always be improved, and I think Lapierre does have the talent. It's just he hasn't really shown it as much as guys like Veleno and Suzuki have. So it'll be interesting to see how his game progresses over the course of the season. I'm not writing him off at all. I was really high on him coming out of the Holinka, but, based on what I've seen out of some of the other players I've tracked so far this year, I'm a little bit cooler on him than maybe where he's ranked.
And so we're going over to the Erie Otters of the Ontario Hockey League. He's a right-handed shot defenseman. He's a Canadian boy, born April 8th, 2002, 5'10". Tell us more about Jamie Drysdale.
Oh, yeah. So Jamie Drysdale, to me, there's no question anymore. He is the best defenseman in this year's draft, and I'm pretty sure he's the only one that I think is really worth a top 10 pick this year. Last year we saw defensemen get drafted in the top 10, top 15 that I think were just drafted there because they're defensemen and teams like defensemen. Good defensemen are hard to find, certainly, but I am not a fan of drafting one really high just to get the best one available that year. I always value drafting the best players available at your pick. And Jamie Drysdale, though, like I said before, if someone went up at 3rd overall and took Jamie Drysdale 3rd overall, I would not be surprised in the slightest. People have asked me a bunch already this season, how does he compare to Bowen Byram? I think they're two different players, and I'm a much bigger fan of Drysdale than I am of Bowen Byram based on what I've seen so far. Bowen Byram certainly produced extremely well offensively. He's a very aggressive attacking defenseman who loves when the puck is on his own stick. He can carry it through the defensive end and into the offensive zone, and he just does things extremely aggressively and extremely well in the offensive sense. Whereas with Jamie Drysdale, I think there's a much more complete two-way game there. He's aggressive with his pinches, similar to how Ville Heinola is in the NHL so far this season. But his ability to, not just focus on attacking with the puck on his own stick, he's able to pass it through the neutral zone extremely effectively, move pucks into the offensive zone really effectively. He's got the skill and the skating to move around the ice with the puck on his stick as well. He just has so many tools in his toolkit that are so, so good to see that I'm a huge fan of Jamie Drysdale. And I mean, he's a player that I think I have maybe top 5. And if he's available outside the top 5, he's a player that I would really, really take a long, hard look at.
I was going to say, how does he compare to Moritz Seider when Seider was taken about 6th overall by the Detroit Red Wings?
Again, two very different players. I think Seider has for his size, he's got a good set of feet. He's a very physical player. He can cut off breakouts really well. I never came away watching him, though, thinking he was a top 10 NHL talent, but I'm not Steve Yzerman, and I'm sure Steve Yzerman is smarter than I am, so I'm not going to judge them too much on taking a swing on a kid that they like. I've heard he's a great kid, and that also helps with his development if he's able to willing to be able to learn in the North American in a North American country in a totally new environment right away when he's 18. I think that's a really interesting thing to have in a kid. But with Jamie Drysdale, I think the tools are at such a high level. And the intelligence is at such a high level already that, if you want a defenseman, it's perfectly reasonable for me to sit at a scouting table and have a team that maybe has a ton of forward prospects already and says, well, when are we going to get the chance to draft a Jamie Drysdale again? He's on pace for 80 points in the OHL, which for a defenseman is enormous. He's involving himself in 30% of his team's goals, which is more than Hendrix Lapierre, who's a center. He's an exceptionally strong offensive player. He's almost doubling the offensive involvement of other defensemen, like a Justin Barron, for example. He's involving himself in more offense than Jean-Luc Foudy, who's another OHL forward who, again, you're looking at a defenseman who is a smart, aggressive defenseman in the most modern sense of the term, but also with a ton of offensive skill that I just really, really like to watch.
And so we're going to move to the German theme, which is Mannheim in the Deutsche Elite League, or known as the German Elite League. Tim Stützle, the left winger, projected to go 10th. So what do you think of Tim Stützle?
I think he's one of the most underrated players in the draft. I've always really liked watching him play, but, I wanted to see him play against men and see what he could do full time. And this year he just has continued to impress me every single time I've watched him. He's one of the best players on that team. And it's really, he really earned his spot on that top line, and he's earning the minutes that he's playing. He's earned the points that he gets. He's a tremendous skilled winger. We were talking about earlier guys who have a lot of skill in the National Hockey League, who can, who have the hands to really maneuver around the offensive end. Guys like an Artemi Panarin. I'm not saying Stützle is like an Artemi Panarin, but he certainly plays that style. His
like that sniper mentality.
Yeah, he can cut into dangerous areas really well. He's an extremely dangerous puck mover. He can carry the puck really well on his own stick. His skating is getting better. I just really, really like Stützle. He's a guy who I think is a top 10 pick, no questions asked. If he's there at 11 or 12 or 13 and you want just a winger who's going to be able to drop right into an NHL roster and I think not look out of place. He's a guy who I could certainly see that being. I mean, he's just, he had one game where he had 5 points, so you have to keep that in mind when you look at his production. But even when you discount that, considering he's playing top line minutes in a men's league, playing top line minutes in the Champions Hockey League and doing extremely well there as well, he does whatever he can to earn points, and it's really, to me, not much of a surprise. But I am still quite surprised at just how good he's been.
So it's looking like in the genealogy of the DEL that we've had the likes of Leon Draisaitl, now Moritz Seider. Now it seems like Tim Stützle is on the same path. So it seems like the DEL is developing really extremely athletic and very gifted wingers and defenders.
Yeah, the thing that has, from what I have heard, something that has really changed in Germany recently is after they went to the Olympic silver medal game, or won the Olympic silver medal last year, they've really put a focus on hockey. I mean, it only just happened under, just about a year and a half ago, so things only changed so much that quickly. But that event kind of changed a lot and put a bigger focus in Germany on hockey. They're bringing in a lot better coaches to develop their youth. And guys like John Jason Peterka and Lucas Reichel and Tim Stützle and last year Moritz Seider, they're getting the benefit of playing a lot more, getting a lot better coaching and development in their upbringing, I guess you could say. And it's really kind of changed for the better for Germany. I do think that there's also sometimes years where national, different countries will have groups of players that just all happen to be the same age and are all just feeding off of one another and continuously getting better. I can't imagine that guys like Seider and Stützle have not played against each other their whole lives, and they kind of have been continuously getting better and outdoing one another, and it kind of feeds off of itself. So I don't know how long-term this trend will be for Germany, but this year is certainly a standout year for German players.
So we're going to keep it on the beer garden theme with this next player you mentioned, Marco Rossi, the Austrian, now the former Zurich ZSC Lion, now with the Ottawa 67s. We all know the Ottawa 67s on the double side because of Mitchell Holscher, Nikita Okhotyuk, and we also know it because of Graham Clark. Tell us about Marco Rossi.
So Marco Rossi might be my favorite player in the whole draft just to watch. If I'm sitting down and I'm watching one game of any of the players at the top end of this year's draft, I think it's Marco Rossi. You might look at his size and kind of write off his two-way game, but there's very rare instances where I'm watching a shift of his and not impressed at least once. His ability to enter puck battles and win them is extremely good. His stick skill is fantastic. His goal scoring ability is great. He's on pace for about a 30-goal season in the OHL, which is very, very notable. But he also has he's on pace for 163 points over a full season. I think he has some things that he needs to rein in mentally. I think he gets a little carried away sometimes. He's been suspended this season already. But I think that those are things you can work through with him. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. You just show him tape of how good he is during a game and go, we need to see more of this and less of the, suspension-worthy stuff. He's very old for the draft class, but even when you consider that, he's gotten off to a tremendously hot start. He's involved in about 60% of his team's goals when he plays, and that's, the only player that even comes close to him is Lafreniere at 55%. So you have two players who are just driving their team's offense almost single-handedly. So I think that his defensive intensity is very good, especially for someone his size. He plays really smart. He seems to have a streak in him that kind of knows how good he is, and I really like that. I like to see kids who embrace their talent and really work hard to show that off and really, impress everyone. It really seems like he's trying to do that, and I think it's working. We'll see how he can sustain that over the course of the full season, but I really just, again, if I'm sitting down just to watch one player, he's really close to the top of the list for all the players eligible this year.
So amongst all the Austrians in the NHL, you've had Michael Grabner, you've had just trying to think of Tomas Van Eck. How does he compare potential wise long term?
I don't think it's even close. I think he's the best Austrian player in recent time, at the very least. I mean, Thomas Vanek had his downsides, but I think he's one of the more underrated offensive players in the last few decades. But when you look at Michael Grabner, not the same type of player. Michael Grabner was an absolute speedster who could score goals. That was kind of really all he did, which is fine. He made himself a great career out of it. Marco Rossi is not that type of player. He's got speed, but it's not that Michael Grabner bye-bye speed. His skill is fantastic. He's hard to knock off pucks, especially considering how undersized he might seem to be. And his two-way game is just really, really well refined already this early in the season. He's a player that I think, if he finishes the OHL season with 120, 130 points, I don't know how he goes back to Ottawa for another season. He's been an exceptional player for 2 years now. And I think that with his defensive responsibility and just how good he is in both areas of the ice and through the neutral zone, I think he could be a guy that just drops right onto an NHL roster next season. And I think that over the course of his whole career, he should be able to really entrench himself as like the pinnacle of Austrian hockey.
So my co-host Jim Berger and I were talking about kids who are absolutely too good for like their junior team. Yeah, they should have a waiver to play at least in the AHL if they can't play in the NHL. Do you think that should be implemented on the on all the NHL agreements for transfer players?
I think that there's a way you could make it work. I think that the concern for junior teams is that they're concerned they're going to lose revenue, So they're concerned that if they let guys go to the AHL who are guys do you want to sell tickets, they're going to lose out on selling those tickets if someone's not there. I think that you could, considering the resources NHL teams have, there could be clauses in contracts that say, okay, we'll pay for the loan of this player to our team for, X amount of games or the full season or whatever. And you can pay the OHL team or the WHL team the money to offset what they're expecting the revenue to be that they would lose. I don't know what that would mean to, if that's doable, but I think the resources are there to make it happen. It's hard to do considering the NHL CBA is not being renegotiated for a while. But I think that it's something that I think NHL teams should be looking for in the next agreement between them, the NHLPA, and the CHL. I think that there is such a thing as letting players go to junior for too long. Guys like Ty Smith, for you guys in Jersey, he's a player that I think should be in the AHL. I think last year he was one of the best defenders in the Canadian Hockey League as a whole. I thought he was one of the most underrated draft picks when he was picked. I had him in my top 10. I love what he brings to the game, but I don't think there's much else he can do in junior. So to have him just go back to junior, and I don't know what they're expecting different out of him. His decision-making in junior is good enough, but it's not good enough for the National Hockey League. I think his defensive play was okay, but not good enough. But
right.
The best place for him to learn is the American Hockey League. So I think long-term, there needs to be an agreement in place to help NHL teams, develop their players the best way they might want the most control over the player for. But with the Canadian Hockey League, I can totally understand their concern. But that doesn't mean that I don't think there's some sort of an agreement they can come to at some point.
I think they can. I think it can earn a few extra dollars especially from the NHL, making all this extra revenue and having the cap go up. I mean, or even if players, with their owners making an extra cash, I think it would be good for the new generation to come into the AHL, etc. But we're going to move on to number 12, Justin Barron of the Halifax Mooseheads, the big powerhouse over the past several NHL drafts with the known of Nikolai Ehlers, Nico Hischier, talk about Nathan McKinnon. Now it's with this defenseman, Justin Barron, you were mentioning earlier. Let's talk about Justin Barron.
Yeah, so Justin Barron's kind of been, according to my sort of ranking tracker that I have, he's been given the title of second best defenseman available. I could see how the potential for that is there, but I don't see it being a realistic bet. You know, he really reminds me last year, looking what I thought of looking at a guy like Philip Broberg. You know, you can see the talent, you see the straight line speed, you see the power and how he skates. You know, you see that tendency to push play positively on his own stick. But when I've watched him and when I track data on him, there's a lot that I think is I think a little lacking with him. Let me just try to pull up his data here. It is there it is. So yeah, like when I watched him play, he could break up breakouts coming against him pretty well. He moved pucks decently well, but his defensive positioning wasn't great. His passing was sometimes just poor. And I think that there are things that you're going to need to work on with him long term to get him off on the right foot in the National Hockey League. I think he's a first round pick guy. I think I'm not afraid to bump him a little bit lower than I think a lot of people might have him right now. I need to see more, but based on what I've seen already, you know, his passing is sometimes good and sometimes very, very bad. His intensity in both ends of the ice is not great, but his ability to skate up the ice and his ability, especially in a straight line, to move around is very, very good. So I think that over the course of the season, I'll be looking for more consistency out of him, a more refined game, you know, putting in a bit more at both ends just to, you know, apply more pressure to your opponent and do things a little bit better in that regard. But yeah, I've been a little underwhelmed from what I've seen of him, especially relative to some other defensemen available in this year's draft. But time will tell, I suppose.
And so we move on to another defenseman, except we're going to the U.S. National Development Program, which had an outstanding year in the draft, dominating the first round and so on and so forth. Jake Sanderson, what do you think of him?
Yeah, so I've been watching a bit of the U.S. Development Program over the last couple of weeks because they're the one team that I didn't really get a good look at. I don't know if Jake Sanderson is going to be a first-round pick. He's big and his skating is pretty good for someone his size. Those are two good things to have. But when you consider the amount of talent that's available elsewhere in this year's draft, I don't see it. I just think that there's just too much good talent that has a lot of potential that can bump him out of the first round. You know, I do like the fact that he's very young for his draft group. He's very tall. He can skate well, but I will need to look at that team more. You know, looking at that team, guys like. Hello?
I'm there. Sorry,
okay.
There's a little background.
That's all right. Anyway, guys like Ty Smolanich, I think stand out a bit more, even though he's a forward. But I think that of the U.S. team defensemen, he is one of the ones that I think has stood out the most. But again, I think considering just how much talent there is elsewhere in this year's draft, I think he might end up bumping himself out of the first round.
And so we're going to talk about Justin Sordiff from the Vancouver Giants, so the center. With this draft class, a lot of kids are under 6'3" in the 5'10" range. What do you think of this kid in Justin Sordiff?
Yeah, so I've only seen one game of Justin Sordiff. The WHL is one that I'm still a little bit behind on. But what I have seen out of him, you know, I think he's a first round pick for sure, no question. I think his involvement has been really, really good. You know, he's scoring a lot of goals on a team that isn't as good as they were last year, I don't think. He's gotten off to a really nice start. He's on pace for 70 plus points, which is pretty typical of a solid first round pick from the CHL. His hands are really good. His shot is pretty good as well. But I do need to dig in more and watch him. I've only seen one game of his, and I have the data that I track, and it seems fine. But I definitely do think that, you know, he's a guy who has a profile that I think if he's available past, I'd say 20, maybe 22 overall based on this year's class, he's a player that I really take a good long look at. I do like the sort of pace control that he brings to the game. You know, I like players that play with a sense of calmness, who have the hands to fend off defenders and make space for themselves. So I'll be interested to see more of him as the year goes on for sure.
And we're going to move on to number 15 in Ridley Greig over in Brandon with the WHL left winger. And what do you think of Riley?
Well,
I'm there.
I'm just pulling up here. Ridley Greig. Yes. So Ridley Greig is a player that is not really ranked in my sort of tracker as a first round guy, but that doesn't mean anything negative. He's very young for this year's draft class. He's pretty big. You know, Brandon is a pretty good program. I did like him, if I'm not mistaken. He was at the Holinka, and he's a player that I did have quite a few notes on to keep an eye on. So again, the WHL is a bit of a blind spot for me thus far in the season. But all things being considered, I thought he had a good, he's a good aggressive forechecking winger. At least that's what I came away with at the Holinka. He plays the right way. He plays his opponent really hard, but he has nice offensive tools, and he's producing pretty well for someone his age. And I think that there's an interesting player there for sure. I don't know about a first round pick considering what's available, but he's very young, and that usually is a pretty decent bet for a player looking forward to their development as the years go on.
And so we're going to wrap up the 16 picks, and then we're going to move on to the 2019 Devils pipeline after that. I want to talk about the AJHL left winger, Dylan Holloway. Do you have any data on him?
Absolutely. So Dylan Holloway is now playing in U.S. college. So he plays with Cole Caulfield and, all those guys in Wisconsin, that all-star team of an offense. And he has been a bit hurt, I think, to get the season started. He's been in and out of the lineup, I think, due to fighting something. I can't remember what specifically it is. But Dylan Holloway is a guy who I've been extremely impressed with when I catch him. I think that there's a lot of inconsistency with him. Some days, one game I watched of him, his first period was absolutely outstanding, but the rest of his game was kind of okay. I watched another game where he played back-to-back defending champions, Minnesota Duluth. And, he had moments of flashes, but, there was most of the game where he was a bit invisible. And that's not a negative. He's one of the youngest, if not the youngest NCAA player this year. And he's playing on a team where he's playing third line minutes. They're not really using him on the power play a whole lot. And I think that, he's going to be a slower burn. I think that after this season, he might need another year of college, which is not a bad thing. He was exceptionally good at the AJHL. And I think it's just a question of him adjusting to the increased pace of play in the NCAA. The physicality is a lot higher. He could get away with a lot in the Alberta Junior Hockey League last year. His skill is fantastic. He plays his opponents really hard. He gets himself involved offensively extremely intensely. And I think he's going to be a guy that NHL coaches are going to really give a lot of rope to. He's got a ton of skill. His skating ability is really good. He's hard to knock off the puck when he's really going. And I think that long term, there's a really, really good player here if he can capture his game at his best. He really reminds me maybe of a bit of a Dylan Cousins from last year. Just an all-around really skilled offensive player. I was cooler on Cousins than most, and I think Holloway's upside is a bit higher than what I saw out of Cousins last year. But, he certainly works very hard during games, and he's a player that I've always really, really liked to watch.
And so we're going to move over to the 2019 pipeline. We already know all about Jack Hughes. My overall take on him was, outstanding center. He's basically a mix of Patrick Kane with the vision, the smarts of a bit of a Crosby. But to me, his undersizing was a little bit more like Patty Kane. And then he seemed like the way he's picking up his defensive skills now seems he's learning it from Nico Hischier. So I'm starting to see him become from a B+ player to an A-. What do you give him a rating of?
Well, Jack Hughes was a guy that I felt was a pretty safe first overall pick last year. People were kind of A-B'ing him with Capo Caco a bit. And I think you could have had the discussion, but if I'm at that scouting table, I would have pushed extremely hard for Jack Hughes. I think that in terms of like a rating, I always saw him as that sort of, I guess to use your system, an A- type of player. Really dangerous transitional center, creative offensive player who could score pucks on his own, just used his line mates extremely effectively. I found him to start last season a bit careless. I thought that he maybe was a bit too aware of how good he was and tried to get away with a lot that you probably couldn't get away with in the National Hockey League. And I think that in the National Hockey League, he's kind of swung to the opposite end. I don't know if that's the coaching or what, but it really feels like they're trying to get him more refined, away from the puck as opposed to letting him go completely freely offensively, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, especially so early in his career. And he seems to have started to really pick things up in the last few games. I'm thrilled that he's a Devil. I think that it's a good fit for him. If that team can sort of sort out the other issues they're having, I think he's a really good anchor and potential number one center for that team long term. And even if he's not a number one center long term, whatever that means, being him with a Nico Hischier, I think is a no brainer long term. And I think he's come along really, really nicely so far.
For me, it's like if you had, like, I always talk about on Pucks and Pitchforks when I write, I always said before the Devils selected, I said, Shiro always had Crosby and Malkin when he was in Pittsburgh, when he took over the team, and then he had Jordan Staal as his third center. And, I do want to touch on the Russian players with the CHL and Russian games coming up. I really like Nikita Okhotyuk being a physical guy, having him with the 67s. I saw that you weren't as high as on Okhotyuk on your YouTube channel, but I do like your constructive criticism. Can you tell us some of your your likes and dislikes and what he's going to need to improve upon?
Sure. So Okhotyuk, he's a player that I think is, he gives and he takes. I think that he's a big player, again, similar to Jake Sanderson. He's a big guy who can skate pretty well. Didn't produce particularly well last year in terms of production. It was okay, but not necessarily great or anything that I would bet on long term in terms of success. He's a physical guy for sure. I think his decision making needs a lot of work. I don't know. There are situations where I've seen him. There was one game this year, for example, I saw him. He was on his own in his own end with the puck, and he just tried to pass it and just whiffed, and it just ended up again as a goal against, which I believe put them down a goal. And you just can't have defensemen have that happen. And I've seen him make poor decisions a little bit too much. It's not all bad. I think that his package in terms of his physicality is something that you do need in the National Hockey League. I think mobile, physical defensemen is kind of something that the National Hockey League has moved away from in recent years. There's a lot of guys who previously were immobile and physical, and I think that now the league is looking more at the physical and mobile. Guys like Moritz Seider is a great example of that. Whereas Nikita Okhotyuk, I think, has a similar profile, but I'm not totally sure it's all there right now. He might be a player that comes along in a long period of time and maybe is a sort of bottom pairing penalty kill guy, but I could be wrong. I mean, the thing about the Devils draft last year that stood out to me was that they went after Okhotyuk type defensemen more than once. And I'm okay with my scouts, if I'm a general manager, going after different types of players and sort of casting a wide net. But going after that type of player in such a pivotal draft, I think, for the Devils, that many times might not have been the direction that I would have gone, but such is life. And I mean, hopefully out of that group of defensemen, they'll get at least one that can be a serviceable, physical, two-way minutes eating guy.
For me, it's like you want to have a guy who's as mobile as, let's say, John Moore in the past, but you want someone who's more physical than Anton Volchenkov, the Russian bang them and knock away pucks and, take away lanes. Also, I want to talk about another physical yet very mobile player in Daniil Misyul, because we have the Russian theme going on versus the CHL teams. What do you think of Misyul at 70th?
The thing about Misyul, I thought he was drafted a bit high, especially considering where, who was available at that pick and considering the Devils and how their draft turned out. I think that the thing about Misyul is when you watch defensemen in Russia play in Russia, I don't think that to stand out as a mobile physical defenseman, you have to do a whole lot. I think that the level of play for defensemen in Russia is much different than it is in North America. They're not as physical from what I've seen. They're not as intense on the puck. They kind of tend to use their sticks a lot more. They play the puck instead of the body a lot. So when you have a player like Musial who brings that, physicality, who he'll take the body before the puck, I think that's kind of where he stands out. So I'm always going to err on the side of caution when it comes, especially to Russian defensemen. You don't know really what they are in North America until you play them in North America. So, he's been good in the KHL. I will give him that. The KHL, though, that style of hockey, you can go and look at some video. Some forwards get away with stuff that in the National Hockey League you never, ever see, mostly because defensemen in the National Hockey League, yes, they might play the puck a lot, but they will punish you for trying to be too fancy. They will come at you hard, and Musial does that. So I think Musial, there's all the potential in the world that if he keeps playing that style of game and continues to improve, could be an NHL player. I just remember watching a lot of Yaroslava last year, thinking he was an impressive defenseman, but being an impressive defenseman at the MHL level, there's a lot of defensemen in that league who would probably not even cut it in a Canadian Hockey League setting. So it's still very early in his career. I won't write anything off, but it's just a question of, how will it translate if he ever comes to North America?
One of the things that I noticed the Devils, use to their advantage is using a guy like Sergei Brylin, a former Red Army player, who is an AHL assistant coach in Binghamton and in the old Albany Devils teams. I find that he's helping a lot of the Eastern European players a lot because of the language barrier and being able to relate and them assimilating into the North American ice. That's where I think they rely on those safety nets. And then I also want to talk about Arseny Gritsyuk.
Yep. Yeah. So Arseny Gritsyuk is a player who stood out to me. I was doing some tracking for Pavel Dorofiev for a video I made on him. And they played their playoff series against Omsk, which is the team that Gritsyuk plays on. And he caught my eye in the game that I was watching. He scored a hat trick, Gritsyuk did. And he scored a hat trick that wasn't just, he slapped a puck from the blue line and the goalie just played it in and went in. He was scoring goal scorers' goals. And I thought, okay, this guy didn't have crazy good stats in the MHL, so let's check him out. And I came away really, really impressed from what I was seeing. And so much so that I ended up putting a video together on him. It's on my YouTube channel. You can check it out. But I thought that to see him drafted, especially after the under-18 that I saw out of him, I was really, really happy to see him get picked and see someone take a swing on him. I think he's a guy who long-term will get better. I think players who were a lot more of a long shot got picked before he did this year. And I think that considering his game, I really like it. He's a creative playmaker. His skating is good. He can carry pucks really nicely. His offensive game in the offensive end is really impressive at that level. He's improved his game this year with Omsk. I don't know if he's a KHL player this year. He's, again, like I said, a slower burn. He's a player I thought would be a better fit in the Canadian Hockey League. He tends to thrive on being pressured by players. He's able to get around defensemen really well. He's able to move pucks into dangerous areas. And I found a lot of the time last year, he was doing a lot and trying a lot of things, and his line mates, I just don't think they were on the same page as him a lot of the time, which might be why his production wasn't particularly fantastic. But he has improved this year pretty well, and I'm really excited to see where his career goes. I mean, he's a player, again, that I thought would be a Canadian Hockey League player. Maybe he's back in the Canadian Hockey League next year, but right now I think he's improved his play at the junior league level in Russia, and he's done it looking pretty good as well. And I think that long term he could be a nice find for the Devils.
I think, when you look at those Russian players in the deep drafts in the past, kind of like Pavel Datsyuk, on the Datsyuk scale, what would you rate him?
I don't think he's that good. I don't think he's on that level. I honestly, when I watched him play, it was really hard for me to, the whole point I was trying to make with the video I put together was I don't know what he's going to be, but if he can be what he was, what I saw, and continue to be that type of player at the next level, he could be a good hockey player. I think he could be a serviceable offensive winger in the National Hockey League if his style of play can translate. Obviously, playing in his conference in the MHL, which is pretty weak relative to the West, and not playing in a men's league yet, that's a question mark. But I am expecting him to, come over in the Super Series with the Russian team and play pretty well. Go to the World Juniors and play pretty well. He stood out at the under 18s, So when he gets put in a higher level of competition, he never looks out of place. And the Russian program seems to believe in him as well. So I'm a really big fan of all those things put together for him. Pavel Datsyuk, I think, is a situation where a team did their homework and drafted a player who no one else had their eye on in a time where Russian players were still seen as a bit of a question mark. I think that trend is changing nowadays. I think a lot of Russian players are thinking about getting out of Russia more and more. Gritsyuk, I think, is a player that long-term will need to continue developing on his skills. But in terms of being an offensive creative player, and his line mates get more in terms of a mental level on his level in terms of thinking the game, then I think there's a lot to like with him, and his production should follow that. He's doing a lot on his own right now. And I think that over time, when things get ramped up a bit, he should fit in really nicely.
All right, so we're going to move on to the 80th overall pick from the Ottawa 67s, Graham Clark. I like what I saw in his preseason. He was working on the power play. He looked really good on his shot. He was using the mid-danger a lot in those situations from the point. What did you expect out of Graham Clark in the Cherry Ore tournament?
Right. So with Graham Clark, I've always come away impressed with his skill. That's kind of what my read was on him. The goal scoring was always there. I always felt that this was a guy who, when push came to shove in dangerous areas, he was going to score goals. Really similar to me, a profile as a guy like Alex Bocage last year. I think Bocage brings a bit more to the game overall than Graham Clark does, but the best assets of his game really resonated similarly to me as a Bocage did. So you're going to get a guy who in tight has nice hands. He can find the back of the net pretty well. But with Graham Clark, I feel like there needs to be a bit more there for me to really be as big of a fan of him as some other people were. He shows really nicely. He shows up on the highlight reels for sure. But I'm always wary of players who score a ton of goals relative to their total point totals. 7 goals and 2 assists so far this year is not, it's obviously fantastic in terms of goal scoring, but there's more to the game than just scoring goals. And I think that obviously scoring goals is something you need, but when I'm watching hockey, I want my guys on the ice to be able to push play better in both ends of the ice, get pucks back, move them up the ice, because without that, you can't score goals. And if Graham Clark can be just a trigger man and score goals at the NHL level as a, third line guy who just scores goals and is on the second unit power play and scores maybe 20 goals, 15 assists every year, then you're golden. You get a decent, serviceable NHL player out of that. But usually you see players who fit that mold still be extremely talented, multifaceted players in junior. And I'm not quite sure Graham Clark has that side of his game to him, especially on a team as good as Ottawa. I would expect the 67s to have multiple lines full of guys who can score and set up plays. And Graham Clark's point totals, at least through the first 9 games he played this year, and I believe he's hurt now, haven't really.
That is correct. He is hurt.
Yeah, so we'll see. Obviously, he's a player that I think the Devils sign as, ELC after next season and give him a shot in the AHL and see what he can do. I certainly think that the skill in tight where, things get dirty around the net and his shot are good enough to be a legitimate NHL potential player. My personal biases kind of discount players like him a little bit more than I think some other people.
And so when we talk about discounts, who do you think you would have looked at a little bit differently?
In what sense? You mean
in terms of being a better forward who can do a little bit more than just being offensive?
Like in 2019, you mean?
Yeah, in 2019 going forward.
Well, I think so. When I look at the game, I try to think of the game of, it's about how you approach the game. What do you want to see out of your players? So I look at where Graham Clark was drafted, for example. Someone, even like a Maxim Chajkovic, who went 89th to Tampa Bay, was a player that I thought would have been a much more well-rounded choice than a Graham Clark. His shot is fantastic, Chajkovic. I mean, so is Clark's, but there's more to Chajkovic's game, and I think he was a bit downtrodden playing for St. John. I think that was a problem for him. His team was not good. He's off to a rough start this season as well. St. John as a whole is off to a really bad start. I always thought that was a player that I might have looked at a little bit more. I don't know how he interviewed, but anyway, beyond that, I'm looking for players that push the play up the ice. When you either have the puck or you don't have the puck. And when you have the puck, are you positioning yourself so that you're an open man for your wingers or your center or your defenseman to find you? Are you rushing the puck on your own stick into a 1-on-4, or are you maintaining possession, or to move pucks to a teammate, or are you dumping and chasing the puck on your own using your speed? There's a bunch of different ways you can play, and I think some guys are guys who prefer to maybe not be the guys that push pucks up the ice and would rather set up positionally well in the defensive zone so that they're sort of a point man to get pucks to the center to break it out instead, or in the offensive zone, they stop up along the faceoff dot and become a trigger man there and just kind of skate around maintaining open space. That's fine. That's a perfectly legit way to play. But I just feel like looking for players that bring multiple different talents in that area, I think are players that I would maybe look a little bit more at. So, a player who in another player like in Graham Clark's range that kind of sticks out for a bit of a different reason would be like an Anthony Honka, who went 83rd overall. If the Devils came away in the second round, if I'm looking at this correctly, so if they had come away in the second round with Daniel Musial and Anthony Honka, for example, that would have been very interesting to me. Anthony Honka's raw talent is tremendous. His skating ability is fantastic.
They did say that Honka was going to be better than his brother at the NHL level.
Could see that.
But they did say that there were some problems on the Finnish team that they benched him for at the World Juniors.
Yeah, Honka is a player that has a ton of upside, but the decision making was very, very poor at times, and it got so bad with him at one point that it cost his team a championship. So I think that's though something that can be rectified. And when you look at how he's played this year with a very, very good team in Finland, he's done an extremely good job involving himself offensively, and at both ends of the ice, he's done a very, very good job. He was great in a summer tournament, and I really think that last year was a really big learning experience for him. I think Carolina is a good fit for him, but I thought that he pushes play. He has the ability to carry pucks up the ice. His passing ability, his raw passing ability is very good. His decision making is an issue, certainly, and most of the time that's a big thing that holds you back. But it's a question of, what does he bring to the game that pushes play in your favorable direction? And so with Graham Clark, obviously putting pucks in the net, that's a very favorable thing to do. The more you put pucks in the net, the more likely you are to win. But there's a lot more to the game that I think comes that factors into allowing a player like Graham Clark score a lot of goals. And I always gravitate towards more players who play more with that focus, as opposed to the guys who, around the net are devastating, because there's a lot that goes into the game that gets them to the front of the net. And
speaking of, physical defenders, keeping the pucks away from the net as much as possible, Don Cherry would probably like this player in Oakville, Ontario. You have a kid for the Kitchener Rangers in Michael Vukojevic. Tell us a good background of Michael Vukojevic.
Well, he was a player that I saw some people had ranked as a first rounder before the season began. Whenever I watched him, he always struck me as the type of defenseman that personally I wouldn't really want on my team. He's a player that I think a lot of a certain type of hockey mind really likes to watch play. He'll make fans of the game, or at least fans of a team, really excited. He goes for the body a lot. He likes hitting guys. He likes putting guys on the ice. taking the body, doing that sort of old school hockey type of thing.
Scott Stevens style.
Yeah. I just feel like there's more to the game in 2019 that strikes me as maybe the Devils, again, drafting a third defenseman that plays like him, might be barking up the wrong tree to go after that type of player so often. I think I've always come away, I've seen Mike Vukojevic play quite a bit, and there's a lot of times where he'll take the body, but teams are so fast that they have other wingers just skate behind him, and then you have a 2-on-1. And that can be a problem. You need your defensemen these days to be a bit more passive in their own zone, kind of let the play come to you and strike when the iron is hot. And I think he focuses a bit too much on taking that body and pinning them against the boards right at the blue line. And when you have a system that might not be able to cover for that particularly well, which might be a little tough in certain situations, it puts your team at a bit of a disadvantage. And that reflected on some of the numbers that I ran against him last year. He's one of these guys that everyone said was a great defensive defenseman, but the numbers just didn't add up. And when you looked at the players that he played with, the numbers were more favorable towards them. Some of them were 6 inches shorter than he was. And, yes, you need guys who can play physically, but I've always come away with him thinking, okay, when things get ratcheted up and the pace of play moves up, I'm not sure there's going to be enough there for him to be a significant NHL minutes eater. Maybe as a penalty killer, you could see it potentially. I don't know if the mobility is there. The offensive tools are okay, I suppose. But he's just one of these players that I think the narrative doesn't really line up with what the on ice results are.
And so we're going to move on to the next player. It's going to be Tice Thompson, the brother of Tage Thompson. He's a 6 foot tall, 165 pound center. Last year he had 25 points in 42 games for Providence College. Now he has 14 points in 8 games, 50-50 on the goals and assists right there, percentage-wise, in 8 games.
Yep. So this is a player that I didn't really know a ton about going into this season. And I'm going to have to look. It's interesting when you see NCAA players get off to really, really hot starts. Usually they play teams in the same conference in a given weekend, for example. So I would need to. I'm going to try to find it as we speak to see against. But at the end of the day, I mean, his scoring rate has been extremely good. No doubt about that whatsoever. So I think that considering he's just a player that I didn't really know a whole lot about. And when you're drafting 20-year-old playing in the NCAA, Providence doesn't play in the most intense conference in the NCAA from what I can recall. I'm just pulling it up now. Hockey East. That's a good. Okay, I was mistaken. That's a good.
It's a darn good conference, especially with the Beanpot.
For some reason, I thought they were in the Ivy League conference in the ECAC, but they are not. But anyway, so they've been, so I'm looking at the teams that he's played. So Maine, St. Lawrence, Clarkson, 2 points against Boston College. A lot of these teams are not great programs, but he did play well against Boston College a couple of games. So it's a mixed bag. I think you're going to need longer samples before getting really, really excited. Keep in mind that most North American players, 2 things actually. One is most North American players his age, it's their first year in the AHL. So if he leaves college next season and comes to the AHL, it's going to be his first year when most Canadian Hockey League players, for example, are entering their second AHL season. So the clock is kind of ticking when you draft a 20-year-old right away. And when you look at his track record, the other thing is when you look at his track record, it would be very strange and sort of an outlier to see him maintain this type of a scoring pace for the whole season. He's been a sub-point per game player almost every single year. In prep school was the last time he was over a point per game. And I've found prep school players, can get away with quite a lot and still be very good. So the fact that he wasn't completely blowing away the competition in prep school and then a year in the USHL and then a year in the NCAA, it kind of doesn't really pass my smell test, but obviously stranger things have happened. I think Jack Dugan on his line really has helped. He's a player that I think is a very legit talent, even though he's a year older. But at the end of the day, production is production, and it comes from somewhere. So we'll see. It's a promising start for him, and we'll have to see how things
And
go.
the next player would be Case McCarthy, the kid in the video the Devils had. Jack Hughes mentioned. Do you like Case McCarthy? I know I do.
Yes, I came away liking him at the on the U.S. national team. It was hard to get a read on him because he didn't play a ton, but he did seem very much like a very calm, possession controlling defenseman. You know, I didn't really see him as a flashy guy. He wasn't, he's a physical player for sure. He's a physical defenseman. That is true. But the thing that I really liked about him is that relative to someone like a Mike Vukojevic, I liked that he's able to not just take a body, but when the puck is on his stick, he's able to make a breakout pass. He's able to, go D to D if need be. And I think that he's another one of these players that, over time, if he can develop and refine his puck skill and his skating ability, I think that there could be an interesting player here. His intelligence, I think, is what's underrated about him. So I think that long term there could be an interesting player here. But again, it's going to be a question of when things get ratcheted up, when he hits the AHL, when he hits the NHL, if ever, will he be able to keep up? Will he be able to play the same way then? And I'm unsure because again, it was really hard to get a read on him with the USDP last year with so much talent on that team, but also will his profile translate when he isn't the best skater, when he prefers to seem to take the body and just make that D-to-D breakout pass.
And so we're going to move on from defensemen to someone in the net. And last year, the Devils drafted the Janesville Jets North American Hockey League goaltender Cole Brady, who's now with the USHL's Fargo Force. 3.23 goals allowed average. I know his save percentage is just under 900. But he is going to be on an Arizona State University team with Eddie Lack as his goaltending coach. So let's talk about Cole Brady.
Yeah, so the NAHL, to me, from what I've been able to see, not a super high level of hockey. I think the only NHL goaltender that has played significantly recently from that league when they were drafted was Connor Hellebuck. And I'm pretty sure Connor Hellebuck was up in the 920, 930 range when he was drafted and was facing something like 40 shots a game. So the Jets just kind of took a swing on this guy who was facing a lot of pucks, and it seems to be sort of working out for him. Now, Cole Brady is 6'5", so obviously that's an asset to a lot of National Hockey League teams. They love goaltenders with size, but I like goaltenders with track records, and his track record is mediocre, I would say. And, he's going to play a full season in the USHL, which is great. He's going to go to the Arizona State program, which has only gotten better over the years. So he's in a good position developmentally to learn a lot and be, given plenty of time to develop. But honestly, having any sort of formed opinions on him that are concrete at this point would be silly. And I really don't know what to make of it. 18-year-old goaltenders, you never really know. But I would not be surprised to see him not really go anywhere. I think the Devils just liked him, liked his size, and just kind of want to see what happens.
Well, he did recently have a shutout in his first USHL game, so there is something that they see in his ability to track pucks and be able to keep the puck in front of him, whether it's him or it's the defense. Who knows what the overall ability it is to have him succeed at the next level. I do think Arizona State will make him an even better goaltender, especially with a former Devil and really good Swedish backup goaltender in Eddie Lack.
Yep, it's fine. It's Arizona State certainly has come a long way, and so it's a good program. I think it's an underrated program. They're getting better. They are certainly making noise in the NCAA world in terms of, visibility and making sure everyone knows that they are a legit NCAA program. And he should get a lot of time on that program. They still seem to not be able to attract a real A-level player to that program in recent time. But that's not a negative. I think it's going to give him plenty of chances to take a big step.
And so when we talk about the next step, we're going to talk about another North American player, this one being Patrick Moynihan, another Jack Hughes favorite, 5'11". He's a center. He's at Providence College. What do you like about Patrick Moynihan? What do you not like about Patrick Moynihan?
So Patrick Moynihan last year was a guy who once in a while, when I would see the U.S. national team play, he stood out. I think that he certainly had moments, right? He was a guy who once in a while you'd see something really, really impressive. His hands would impress you getting around a defenseman. His ability to think the game was really nice. I think he just was a nice all around two-way player. He doesn't really have super high upside, I don't think, but his offensive output was good, I would say. His line mates were extremely good. Obviously, that team was unbelievable. And his under 18 was pretty solid. I don't know what his future might be in the National Hockey League, and I don't think anyone who's making definitive claims about him really know much right now. He's under a point per game in the NCAA to start, so that kind of leads me to believe that he's at least another year or two away from the AHL, which is totally fine by me. I think if you have the time, you should use it, unless you're 100% sure about your player. And I think that Moynihan, if you get a versatile sort of fourth line guy who can drive possession really nicely, and you get him in the 6th round of the draft, and maybe he works out for a couple of seasons and then you find a better replacement, that's perfectly logical and reasonable to me. In that area of the draft, I think that's when around it started to get to the point in my mind that you could pretty much throw a dart at a dartboard.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're trying to shoot for a bullseye or you go outside of the bullseye.
Yeah, I think that there were players, I think, that had more upside that might be a bit riskier for one reason or another that you could have drafted in that range. But certainly considering what I had heard about him as a person, what I had seen of him on the ice, I think it's perfectly reasonable that he could be, at the very least, a good NCAA player, that might lead him to a good AHL career. And from there, if the Devils are willing to plop him in for here and there as a 4th line guy, maybe even a 3rd line guy if things break the right way, I don't see that as completely out of the realm of possibility. He's one of those guys that you don't notice a whole lot, but that's not a bad thing. I think guys who you notice for bad reasons are worse than guys you don't notice. So I think that having a player like that could be a benefit long-term for New Jersey.
Yes, it sounds like a promising, 4th line player who would do a lot better than John Hayden at any moment. I would rather have.
It's potentially there. It might be a while, but
it'll be worth the wait.
I never found it particularly difficult to watch him play when he was on the ice. Upside, I don't think is there, but over time, you never really know.
And it seems like with the late rounds, we're sticking with the Nordic theme from the past few years. The Devils got Jesper Bratt in the 5th mid-late round. You had Arni Talvidia, in the near late round, and then you got Eetu Pakila from Finland in their junior system. Now we're going to talk about a guy from BIK Karlskoga and Allsvenskan, Nikola Pasic.
So we were just talking about guys who might have been bigger swings, I guess, with a bit more upside in the draft than a guy like Patrick Moynihan. I was really surprised to see Pasic available at 189 and was really impressed to see the Devils take him. They got a lot of really good Swedish players over the last few years, Jesper Bratt, Jesper Boqvist, even Fabian Zetterlund. Their Scandinavian guys seem to know how to pick them, especially when they're given the freedom to swing high. And I think that Nikola Pasic is a guy who, there's I think a bit of work that he could do. His hands are really, really nice. The skating needs work. I think that's kind of the knock that kind of knocked him down a lot. But his offensive game is very, very good. And in the SHL last year, over a 15 game sample, he pushed possession really, really positively. And I think that, internationally, he stood out really nicely. He's a bit old for the draft class, but this year he's been very good in a men's league. And I think that, all things being considered, you can't ask for much more out of your 7th round pick. I still think that, again, when things get ratcheted up and he goes back to the SHL, gets to the AHL, might still be a year or two more of development overseas before that happens. But he certainly has the skill to maneuver around the ice and has the shot and the offensive ability to put points up. It's just going to be a question of the pace of play as things get harder for him. Will he be able to keep up and process things and navigate around the ice the same way he does now? I think it's entirely possible. I had him ranked much, much higher than 189 for sure. And to see him get drafted, I was really happy. I thought that if that was a player that went undrafted, you would have to swing, use a pick higher than the 7th round to take him. So I think the Devils, by virtue of just that, did a good job. And they've done a good job in Europe recently in any case. And I think that Pasic is another example of that.
And I'm going to read you 3 quotes from McKean Hockey, hockeyprospect.com, and future considerations about him. The first one is from McKean's. That says, he has a quick release on his wrist shot and is dangerous when shooting while moving at top speed. Do you think, if he's playing on whether it's a 3rd line, 2nd line, maybe the occasional 1st line, do you think he can cause a lot of trouble, kind of like Jack Hughes does at top speed, quick decision making?
Well, I mean, it's hard to put him in the same category as a Jack Hughes. But I think that, where Pasic kind of is at his best is when the puck is on his stick and he has some time to consider what move he wants to make and what play he wants to make. He makes that. The question for him is going to be, when things get tougher, how does he react? That's kind of the core concern for me. And I think that's why he kind of dropped down the draft a bit. But at the end of the day, I think the talent is certainly there. The speed, I think that McKean's mentioned, I'm not totally sure I see the same thing. But I think that, again, with speed, that's an easy thing that you can keep training. You just keep working at it. And over the years, as long as not too much is expected of you, I think he'll find his way.
And the second one is from hockeyprospect.com. So this is in 2019, says, Pasic is a dangler where he uses his stick handling to dazzle opponents and gets around them using fast hands and great balance. Who does that best resemble at the NHL level?
Oh, man. I don't know. I mean, because Pasic is a guy who, he's a long shot, I think, to be a really significant NHL player. But I've never even given it a thought of who he would compare to in the National Hockey League, to be perfectly honest. I usually don't do NHL comparables in any case, especially with guys who went in the 7th round. He's going to need to carve out his own personality, to be perfectly honest. Stick handling is great. It certainly helps if you want to separate yourself from a defender. But again, there's a lot more to the game that can cause issues just because your stick handling is really good, which for him it is. I don't think that's necessarily a golden ticket to NHL success.
And so the last quote reads, from future considerations in 2019, his excellent vision and passing skills bode well for his teammates, and he is great at making plays happen.
But I believe I certainly could put myself in that category in seeing him that way. I think he's a very, very smart playmaker as well as a scorer. Like, his all-around offensive game is good. And he's certainly producing against men in a pretty good league. But from what I have seen in the Allsvenskan, again, is that the pace of play is quite a lot slower than even the Swedish Hockey League. The guys are pretty good at hockey, but it's not the quickest game down there. I think that the level of play takes a bit of a step back. So it kind of is a good fit for him to get his feet set against men. I think next season would maybe be the year where maybe the Devils call him and send him straight to the AHL, but that might be even a big jump for him. Something like the SHL going back to Linköping might be a fit for him. But the stick handling and the vision and the offensive game is certainly there. And the two-way game and the mobility, I think, is something that you can coach and learn. And I think there's a lot of potential because the skill and the vision certainly is good. And that's really the hard thing to find, or guys who can put all that together, at least offensively, to put the points on.
And
the
it
board.
says in the notes from 2018, 2019, he was in the under 18s. He had 4 goals, 5 assists in 12 games. In the Super Elite League for Linköping, for his hockey club, Junior 20, he had 18 goals, 18 assists in 33 games. So there's a lot of promise there. He's got 5 goals, 9 assists in 17 games with Allsvenskan, that league. Don't you think it's time for him to get promoted back up to Linköping?
Honestly, no. I think that this is a good spot for him. Let him develop, let him grow, let him dominate that league. And then, I'm always a fan of patience, ratchet things up slowly, especially with guys in the 7th round. There's no rush. You have his rights for 4 years. You've got plenty of time to watch him play and watch how his game develops. He's played 17 games this season. He played 17 pro games last year. He's played, under 40 professional games in his whole entire life. So I think you can afford to be a bit patient. And I think letting him, be the guy on his Allsvenskan team, maybe they can push for promotion so that he can be back in the Swedish Hockey League and not have to go anywhere. He could push for that. They're a point behind the promotion spot right now. So maybe that's a thing that they can push for. They have the most offensive goal. They have the most goals for out of any other team in the Allsvenskan. So they should be in the discussion to potentially be a team in the SHL next year. And if he's in that situation, then that's a nice coincidence for him to ratchet the game up a bit for him so he can continue to develop. But I think right now, I think he's in a good spot, especially for someone in the 7th round. And I think that letting him continue to be a focal point is really the ultimate goal, I think, for any team developing an NHL prospect.
So for our listeners, Will Scouch is on Patreon. You can support him. He does a fantastic job covering these topics, and he goes in depth, and he certainly did a lot today. And I absolutely thank you for coming on. I've been looking forward to doing this. I would recommend that you do a ranking of all the NHL teams from each draft class on how each GM should be given a grade. Because usually Winnipeg usually gets like the A's, and usually New Jersey's been ratcheting it up with, the developing of players. I think a grading system for teams with a GM over the years should have a grading system on your podcast on YouTube. I think it would be a good idea to do that.
See, yes, that would be a great idea, but then you've got 31 fan bases, soon to be 32, all looking for a reason to yell at you. So I think that's something I have to be careful around. But you know what? I'm glad we found the time to do this, and I hope it was a satisfactory experience for you and your listeners.
Thank you so much. Sorry for a little bit of the conundrums earlier with the technicals. I don't know what it was because I know I got a good connection on my end. Once in a while it happens with Jim and I.
It happens.
But I would say this was very outstanding. I must put it that way. I've been trying to keep things more positive. Although the Devils won last night against Carolina with Jack Hughes tying up the game at 2-2 with a loose puck, doing a little Henry gets over type of play, and then you have PK Subban who gets the game winning goal. What would that be right there? Then you have Miles Wood, who's been iffy at times this year, but he's certainly starting to show it up. But I do think, we kind of have to rate current NHL players from recent drafts at the NHL level.
Yeah, I think so. I think the Devils are on the right track generally. The team itself might need some work. And, for your listeners, my next project to put together is looking at how Jack Hughes is playing in the National Hockey League and taking a look at that. Certainly have some thoughts. But yeah, I'm hopeful for them. They seem to be interestingly combining different areas in the draft, different styles of players. And I think that the future is bright for them. I think it's just going to require a bit of patience, especially right around now.
Yeah, so you have a lot of exposure to the Canadian market. We have a lot of exposure to the American market, not just New Jersey and New York, but also like Pennsylvania and the surrounding mid-Atlantic and northeastern states. We just started getting exposure to even England.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty wild. I mean, I agree. It's I think the game is growing slowly. It could be growing faster, but at the end of the day, I think it's been pretty good. I think the league, the NHL, has gotten a lot more fun, and I think that's bled through, especially in the American markets. I think from my perspective as a Canadian, it really feels like things have, almost like the American teams have really known how to properly market their teams in a more fun way and accessible way than even the Canadian ones, or at least some of them. But yeah, it's been really interesting to watch from my perspective here being in Toronto.
What I've also noticed on our podcast front that we also have a couple listeners in Australia, because you see the Capitals have success with that one player.
Yeah, it's crazy how that happens. And you know what? We talked about him earlier. A guy like Marco Rossi, a guy like Tim Stützle. These are guys that could be guys who change the game. Leon Draisaitl seems to have started something in Germany a little bit. So that always is something that makes me really excited. There are guys from Japan that are coming through the USHL right now that I think are really intriguing and could be that sort of type of player. So yeah, I'm definitely excited.
I was gonna say I saw somewhere that there was a kid from Japan that came to play in the Canadian development league to get into the CHL eventually.
Yeah.
And lately, I found out that 6% of our viewers are from Romania.
Wow, there have been periods where hockey has been, relatively popular in that area of the world. But you know what? Any sign of growth, and I am 100% on board for it.
And I think the way the game is growing, it's only going to get better, and we're going to find more Anze Kopitars.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully it will build those emerging hockey markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? There's plenty of world that could be doing more for hockey, and hopefully that changes over the next few years.
And maybe with the upcoming events in China, it'll take off.
Hopefully. Yeah.
And so, anyways, we're going to say goodbye to our listeners and to a very successful Sunday.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I hope so.
Thank you for coming.
Anytime, man. Anytime.
All right. Peace out.
See you, man.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.